Let me know if you can see it.
We can see it. Yes, the structure and function of the human brain.
Okay, perfect. Then I'll get started. So, hi everyone, and welcome back to our second class of this short course in neuropsychology. And today's class builds the biological foundation for the rest of the course. And in many ways, I would say that this is one of the most important sessions that we will have in this course of neuropsychology. So, as we discussed last time, neuropsychology sits at the intersection of biology and behavior, which means that before we can meaningfully talk about memory, attention, language, emotion, or executive functioning, we need a shared understanding of the brain itself. So, this session is not about memorizing every anatomical label. I'm not going to ask you to do that, but about understanding how the brain is organized in a way that allows complex human behavior to emerge. So, we will explore how the human brain is structured at a broad level, focusing on its major regions and how they contribute to different aspects of cognition and behavior. So you will see that different brain areas are not specialized in isolation. Instead, they work together as integrated systems. So, for example, something as simple as having a conversation actually requires sensory processing, language comprehension, memory, emotional regulation, and motor planning to all operate simultaneously. So, neuropsychology is about understanding what happens when one or more of these systems is disrupted, like with the examples I gave you last time with certain disorders, and how the disruption shows up in real world behavior. So, everything that we will discuss in later sessions, whether it will be attention deficits, memory loss, language impairment, or changes in personality, rests on the systems that I will introduce to you today. And as we move through this course, you will repeatedly return to the brain structures and networks that we're covering today, using them as a framework for interpreting assessment results, understanding certain clinical cases, and making sense of neurological and psychiatric conditions. So I would say think of today's class as building a map. It does not tell you everything about the terrain yet, but it gives you the orientation that you will need for the journey ahead. So with that, I want to move into why brain structure matters in neuropsychology. So, neuropsychology is fundamentally concerned with understanding the relationship between brain structure and behavior. So, rather than focusing only on symptoms or test scores in isolation, neuropsychologists look for meaningful patterns, patterns of cognitive strengths, weaknesses, errors, and also preserved abilities. So these patterns allow them to make informed inferences about which brain systems are functioning normally and which may be compromised. So in this sense, neuropsychology is a form of applied neuroscience, translating biological information into psychological understanding. So when we observe a particular cognitive profile, for example, intact language with impaired executive functioning, or preserved intelligence alongside severe memory deficits, that we're not simply labeling performance as good or bad. Instead, we're asking for what this pattern tells us about the underlying neural systems. So maybe you already know different types of memory impairments point to different brain structures, just as different attentional deficits suggest involvement of distinct frontal or parietal networks. So over time, clinicians learn to recognize those patterns in the same way that a physician learns to interpret constellations of physical symptoms. And this is why understanding brain anatomy is clinically meaningful and not merely theoretical. So knowledge of structure-function relationships actually helps guide diagnosis, informs treatment planning, and supports rehabilitation strategies. And all of this moves me into talking about levels of brain organization. So the brain can actually be understood at multiple levels of organization. And each level offers a different kind of explanation for how behavior and cognition arise. At the broadest level, we can look at gross anatomy, so large structures such as lobes, cortical regions, and subcortical systems. And this is often the level at which neuropsychologists work because damage or dysfunction at this scale tends to produce recognizable patterns of cognitive and behavioral change. However, this is the only one piece of a much larger picture. So you might have heard that the brain is a very complex structure. There's a lot still unknown about the brain, and you will see that this is the reason why. So beneath the gross anatomy are neural circuits and functional networks, which reflect how different brain regions communicate with one another. So modern neuroscience has shown that most cognitive functions do not reside in a single center in the brain, but instead they emerge from distributed networks that span multiple regions. And when these networks are disrupted, for example, through injury, disease, or neurodegeneration, then the resulting impairments often reflect disconnection rather than total loss of a specific function. So this network-based view is increasingly important in understanding complex conditions such as traumatic brain injury, schizophrenia, and also neurodegenerative disease. And at the most fundamental level, behavior emerges from cellular and chemical processes. So neurons, glial cells, synapses, and neurotransmitters form the biological substrate that makes cognition possible in the first place. So while we are not going to focus in this course on molecular neuroscience, because then this course would expand way more than 10 sessions, then actually it is important to keep this level in mind either way, especially when we're considering pharmacological treatments, maybe medications, and also neurological disease mechanisms. So changes at the cellular or neurochemical level can cascade upward, ultimately altering the large-scale brain networks and observable behavior. So bridging biology and psychology in a very concrete way. And this is what we're addressing in neuropsychology. So at the broadest level, the brain can be divided into four major systems. So the cerebral cortex, subcortical structures, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. So maybe some of these terms are familiar, maybe some are not. That is completely fine. So this is what we're going to discuss today. So each of these systems contributes in distinct ways to cognition, emotion, movement, and behavior. So this type of broad division helps us organize our thinking about brain function, especially when we are first learning how complex the nervous system actually is. However, it is also important to treat these divisions as conceptual tools rather than rigid boundaries. So each of these systems plays a different role in supporting human behavior. So the cerebral cortex is most closely associated with higher cognitive functions, such as reasoning, language, and conscious perception. Subcortical structures are deeply involved in movement, motivation, emotion, and memory processes. The cerebellum contributes to coordination, timing, and increasingly recognized cognitive and emotional functions. And the brainstem, which I think is a lot of times discussed and probably you've heard of it, supports vital life functions and basic arousal. So together, these systems create the foundation for both simple and highly complex behaviors. Also, crucially, none of these systems operates in isolation, as you know. So even the most basic behavior, let's say standing up, speaking, or paying attention, actually requires coordinated activity across multiple brain regions and systems. So when one system is disrupted, the effects often ripple outward, influencing functions that might initially seem unrelated. So, this interconnectedness is a central theme in neuropsychology, and it will repeatedly come up as we examine specific cognitive domains and clinical conditions throughout this whole course. So, the cerebral cortex is the part of the brain most commonly associated with human cognition. So, when we think about activities such as reasoning, problem solving, language, also decision making, and conscious perception, then we are usually referring to cortical processing. So, the cortex forms the outer layer of the brain and is especially well developed in humans compared to other species, reflecting our capacity for abstract thought, complex communication, and flexible behavior. To be honest, everything that we're doing here today. So I am bringing you complex information through complex communication, and you have the abstract thought and flexible behavior to take it in. So in neuropsychology, cortical functioning is central because many higher order cognitive deficits can actually be traced back to disruptions in specific cortical regions or networks. So, one of the defining features of the cerebral cortex is its folded structure. So, as you see also on the slide in the picture, which is made up of ridges called gyri and grooves called sulci. And these folds are not random, though they might seem in the first place, they're not. They actually dramatically increase the surface area of the cortex, allowing more neurons to be packed into a limited space. So this increased surface area supports more complex processing and greater connectivity between brain regions. Also, from an evolutionary perspective, cortical folding represents an efficient way to expand cognitive capacity without requiring a proportionally larger skull. So this is why we have the folds and we don't have to increase the actual size of our skull. Importantly, also to note that the cortex does not function as a single uniform structure. So different areas of the cortex are specialized for different types of processing, such as movement, sensation, vision, or language. And at the same time, these areas work together as part of broader networks, allowing information to be integrated across domains. So damage to the cortex can therefore produce very specific impairments, such as maybe difficulty understanding language or planning actions. And it can leave other abilities intact. So understanding cortical organization actually helps neuropsychologists interpret these patterns and link observable behavior to underlying brain function. So each hemisphere of the brain is divided into four major lobes. So you might have heard the term lobes. So there's the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, and occipital lobe. And these divisions are based on anatomical landmarks rather than sharp functional boundaries. But they provide a useful framework for understanding how different aspects of cognition and behavior are organized. So each lobe is associated with certain core functions, yet none operates in isolation, as we already identified. And most real world behaviors actually rely on coordinated activity across multiple lobes. So the frontal lobes are most closely linked to executive functions, decision making, personality, and voluntary movement. So the parietal lobes are involved in sensory processing, spatial awareness, and the integration of information from different sensory modalities. Then the temporal lobes play a critical role in auditory processing, language comprehension, memory, and emotional processing, while the occipital lobes are primarily responsible for visual perception. So I think the best example to give to all of you here is maybe you also watch TV, some certain TV shows. I used to watch a lot of Dr. House and Grey's Anatomy. And whenever somebody would come in with a brain injury, they would identify from, what symptoms the person is presenting to where it could be linked in the brain. So, for example, if there is loss of vision, then it might be related to the occipital lobe. Of course, without any imaging or further diagnostics, they cannot tell for sure, but it gives them an understanding of where can they start looking. And understanding the functions of the cortical lobes is actually essential for interpreting these neuropsychological profiles, not just in the clinical settings, as I just said with the examples of, patient coming into the clinic, but also in research. So patterns of test performance often reflect lobe-specific dysfunction, such as executive deficits following frontal lobe damage or visuospatial impairments associated with parietal involvement. So by recognizing these patterns, neuropsychologists can make informed inferences about underlying brain pathology and guide, of course, further assessment, as well as contribute meaningfully to diagnosis and treatment planning, which is very important when it comes to the brain, as it is so complex and such a complex structure as we already identified. So now looking more closely at the lobes. So here you see the frontal lobe, and these are central to goal-directed behavior and play a critical role in how we plan, initiate, and regulate our actions. So frontal lobes are involved in executive functions such as decision making, problem solving, planning, working memory, and inhibitory control. So these abilities actually allow us to set goals, evaluate options, anticipate consequences, and adjust our behavior in response to changing circumstances. So in everyday life, the frontal lobes help us behave in ways that are socially appropriate, flexible, and purposeful rather than impulsive or reactive. So damage to the frontal lobes often leads to changes that are subtle, but profoundly disruptive to daily functioning. So individuals with frontal lobe damage may show impaired judgment, poor decision making, difficulty organizing tasks, or reduced ability to inhibit inappropriate responses. So importantly, these changes can occur even when more basic cognitive abilities, such as intelligence, language, or long-term memory, remain relatively intact. So as a result, frontal lobe damage is sometimes overlooked or misunderstood, especially in brief cognitive screenings that do not adequately assess executive functioning. So you might have also heard of examples where some even older individuals, we just put it off as aging, but sometimes it might be some frontal lobe damage. So for example, they have impaired judgment and we put it off as normal aging. Sometimes that is not true. So we need to sometimes adequately assess this executive functioning. And frontal lobe dysfunction can also lead to noticeable changes in personality and emotional regulation, though not always. So some individuals might become disinhibited, impulsive, or socially inappropriate, while others might actually show apathy, reduced motivation, or emotional blunting. So these changes can be distressing, not only for the individual themselves, but also for their family members, as the person may seem fundamentally different, despite appearing cognitively capable in other areas. So for neuropsychologists, recognizing frontal lobe involvement is actually crucial for understanding real-world behavior and for designing interventions that support self-regulation and functional independence. Now moving on to the parietal lobes, which play a central role in helping us understand where things are in space, including the position and movement of our own bodies. So they are responsible for integrating sensory information from multiple modalities, such as touch, vision, and proprioception into a coherent representation of the world and the self. So this integration allows us to interact effectively with our environment. For example, by reaching for objects, navigating through space, or orienting our attention toward relevant stimuli. So when the parietal lobes are functioning normally, these processes occur seamlessly and largely outside of conscious awareness. So as you move your body through space, when you're walking, let's say, from your table to the bathroom, that seems as a normal process. So you don't really think about it. But when damage to these parietal regions happens, it can disrupt spatial awareness and attention in very striking ways. So one well-known consequence is spatial neglect, most commonly associated with right parietal lobe lesions, in which individuals fail to attend to or respond to stimuli on one side of space, often on the left, despite having intact sensory and motor systems. So this is not a problem of vision itself, but of attention and spatial representation. And parietal lobe lesions can also lead to difficulties integrating sensory information, resulting in problems such as impaired body awareness, difficulty recognizing objects by touch, or challenges coordinating perception and action. So these deficits can significantly affect daily functioning, even when strength, sensation, and basic cognition appear intact. So in neuropsychological assessment, parietal lobe dysfunction is often revealed through tasks involving visuospatial processing, construction, and attention, highlighting the importance of these regions in bridging perception and action. Then moving on to temporal lobes. So these play a key role in both memory and language, making them especially important in neuropsychology. So they are involved in auditory processing, language comprehension, and the formation and retrieval of memories. So in the dominant hemisphere, typically the left, the temporal lobe supports understanding spoken language, as you are understanding what I'm speaking right now, while both temporal lobes contribute to processing meaning, context, and emotional tone. So even in the way, the tone that I'm speaking. And because of this broad functional involvement, temporal lobe dysfunction can present with a wide range of cognitive and behavioral symptoms. So a particularly important region within the temporal lobes is actually the medial temporal area, which includes structures such as the hippocampus, which you might have heard of, and surrounding cortical regions. So these structures are essential for formation of new declarative memories, meaning memories for facts and events. So damage to the hippocampus does not typically erase old memories, but it severely impairs the ability to form new memories, and leading to a condition known as anterograde amnesia. So you might have heard of this condition as well. So this what happens if you have damage to the hippocampus. And individuals with this type of impairment may appear alert and intelligent, yet they will be unable to remember conversations or experiences from just minutes earlier. So from what just happened right now. And temporal lobe damage is commonly seen in conditions such as epilepsy, stroke, traumatic brain injury, and neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's disease. So in neuropsychological assessment, temporal lobe dysfunction often becomes apparent through poor performance on memory tasks, difficulties with verbal comprehension, or problems recognizing familiar information. And understanding the role of temporal lobes helps clinicians distinguish between different types of memory disorders and identify whether impairments are likely due to encoding, storage, or retrieval problems. And coming to the occipital lobes, which are primarily responsible for visual processing and form the brain's main center for interpreting visual information. So they receive input from the eyes via the visual pathways and are responsible for processing basic features such as light, color, shape, depth, and motion. So when the occipital lobes are functioning normally, this processing happens rapidly and automatically, allowing us to recognize objects, navigate our environment, and make sense of what we see without conscious effort. It is important to distinguish between problems with the eyes themselves and problems with the brain's interpretation of visual input. So damage to the occipital lobes does not cause blindness in the eyes, meaning that the eyes may still receive visual information normally. But instead, individuals may experience cortical visual impairment, where visual signals reach the brain but cannot be properly processed or interpreted. And this can result in difficulties such as visual field deficits, sometimes also blackout, impaired object recognition, or an inability to perceive motion, even though the eyes and optic nerves are intact. So, as I gave the example earlier, there might have been a patient coming in saying they suddenly lost vision. So it's not to do with the eyes themselves. Their eyes are functioning fine, but it is to do with the occipital lobe in their brain. So in clinical and neuropsychological contexts, occipital lobe damage can present in subtle but functionally significant ways. So individuals may struggle to recognize familiar objects or faces, misinterpret visual scenes, or have difficulty reading or navigating spaces. And these impairments are often revealed through tasks assessing visual perception, visual discrimination, and visuospatial processing. So beneath the cerebral cortex lie a group of interconnected subcortical structures that are critical for many fundamental aspects of cognition and behavior. So these structures include the basal ganglia, thalamus, hypothalamus, and components of the limbic system. So maybe some of these terms you've heard, maybe some you haven't. Again, no need to memorize them, but this class is about just understanding, as we will return to some of these terms in our future classes as well. So while these are not directly involved in higher level conscious processing in the same way as the cortex, they play essential supporting and regulatory roles that allow cortical functions to operate smoothly and effectively. So subcortical structures are especially important for movement, motivation, memory, and emotional regulation. So for example, the basal ganglia are deeply involved in motor control and habit learning. The thalamus acts as a relay for sensory and motor information, and limbic structures can regulate emotion and memory. So because these systems are so closely integrated with cortical networks, dysfunction in subcortical regions can lead to widespread cognitive and behavioral effects, even when the cortex itself remains structurally intact. So these areas are particularly relevant in movement disorders and psychiatric conditions. So I study Parkinson's disease. It's my primarily research area, and it mostly got to do with the basal ganglia. Also in conditions like Huntington's disease and dystonia, they involve dysfunction of these subcortical motor circuits, and mood disorders and anxiety disorders and schizophrenia are associated with abnormalities in the limbic and thalamocortical pathways. So again, in neuropsychological assessment, subcortical dysfunction often produces a distinct pattern of slowed processing, executive difficulties, and emotional changes, highlighting the importance of these structures in both neurological and psychiatric presentations. So speaking more closely about the basal ganglia, they are a group of subcortical nuclei that play a crucial role in the control of movement, particularly in initiating, regulating, and smoothing motor activity. So, as I mentioned, these are involved in Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's disease is um, often and most of the time presents with movement symptoms when patients have tremor. So now you understand why. So rather than generating movement directly, the basal ganglia actually modulate motor signals coming from the cortex, helping to ensure that movements are appropriately timed, scaled, and coordinated. So when these circuits are functioning properly, then movement appears fluid and automatic, allowing us to perform everyday actions without conscious effort. And in addition to motor control, the basal ganglia are deeply involved in learning routines and habits. So they support procedural learning, which allows skills such as typing, driving, or walking to become automatic through repetition. So these habit-based learning processes actually free up cognitive resources, enabling us to focus attention on higher level goals rather than on the mechanisms of action. And as I mentioned, disorders such as Parkinson's disease directly involve basal ganglia circuits, particularly those dependent on dopamine. So in Parkinson's, degeneration of dopaminergic neurons disrupts communication within these circuits, leading to the hallmark motor symptoms such as bradykinesia, rigidity, and the common Parkinson's disease tremor. And beyond the motor symptoms, basal ganglia dysfunction also contributes to cognitive and emotional changes. For example, slowed thinking, executive dysfunction, and also mood disturbances. So understanding basal ganglia is therefore very essential for interpreting both the non-motor and motor features of movement disorders. Now moving to the thalamus and hypothalamus. So the thalamus acts as a central gateway for sensory information in the brain. So nearly all sensory input, for example, visual, auditory, and somatosensory, passes through the thalamus before being relayed to the appropriate areas of the cerebral cortex. So this routing function allows the brain to organize, prioritize, and integrate sensory signals rather than receiving them as unfiltered input. So in this way, the thalamus plays a key role not only in perception, but also in attention and consciousness. So beyond simply relaying information, the thalamus helps regulate the flow of sensory input based on cognitive demands and arousal states. So it works closely with the cortical and brainstem systems to determine which signals are amplified and which are suppressed. So damage to the thalamus can then lead to a wide range of symptoms, including sensory disturbances, attentional deficits, altered levels of alertness, and disruptions in the sleep-wake cycles. In contrast, the hypothalamus is primarily concerned with regulating basic survival functions and maintaining internal balance, or known as homeostasis. Sorry. It controls processes such as hunger, thirst, body temperature, sexual behavior, and hormonal regulation through its close interaction with the endocrine system. So, although it is small in size, the hypothalamus has a powerful influence on behavior, linking physiological states to motivation and emotion. So dysfunction in this region can lead to profound changes in things like appetite, sleep, stress responses, and hormonal balance. So this demonstrates how biological regulation directly shapes behavior. And coming to the limbic system. The limbic system is a network of interconnected brain structures that plays a central role in linking emotion and memory. So rather than being a single anatomical structure, the limbic system, as the name implies, system, includes several key regions, such as the amygdala, hippocampus, cingulate cortex, and parts of the hypothalamus. So together, these areas help determine how we experience emotions, assign emotional significance to events, and store emotionally meaningful memories. So this close integration explains why emotionally charged experiences are often remembered more vividly than neutral ones. And one of the most important functions of the limbic system is emotional learning, which allows us to associate certain stimuli or situations with positive or negative outcomes. So, for example, the amygdala is especially critical for processing fear, threat, or emotional salience, while the hippocampus contributes to forming contextual and episodic memories. So, through their interaction, the limbic system helps us learn from experience and adapt our behavior accordingly. So, when this system is functioning normally, emotional responses are appropriately regulated and integrated with memory and decision making. And damage or dysregulation within the limbic system can profoundly affect mood, emotional responses, and behavior. Traditionally, the cerebellum has been associated primarily with movement, balance, and coordination, and it plays a critical role in fine-tuning motor activity, ensuring that movements are smooth, precise, and well-timed. When the cerebellum is functioning normally, motor actions appear effortless and well coordinated. Damage, however, to the structure classically results in symptoms such as ataxia, tremor, and poor balance, which historically led to the cerebellum being viewed as a purely motor structure. And as I said, we're still learning a lot about the brain. So, more recent research has shown that the cerebellum also contributes to cognition and emotion. So, the cerebellum is extensively connected to cortical regions involved in executive function, language, and emotional processing. So, these connections allow it to support the timing, sequencing, and modulation of cognitive and emotional responses in much the same way that it refines motor actions. So, cerebellar damage can therefore affect thinking speed, cognitive flexibility, and emotional regulation, even in the absence of prominent motor symptoms. So, as you see, the more we're learning about the brain, the more complex it's becoming, and you can see that there's always something new about the brain. If you'll open some medical news and read about neuroscience, we find new things about the brain every day, about functions, about certain regions. Every day there's something new. And the brainstem, which a lot of neuroscientists say is the most important part of the brain, is responsible for supporting the most basic and vital functions necessary for survival, including breathing, heart rate, blood pressure, and basic reflexes. So as you know, if there's damage to the brainstem, then we're like next option, there's no further options, right? So that's it. So it connects the brain to the spinal cord. That's why it's called the stem. And it serves as the major pathway actually for sensory and motor signals that are traveling between the body and the brain. And because of its central role in regulating life-sustaining processes, the brainstem operates largely outside of conscious awareness, continuously maintaining physiological stability. And in addition to its role in autonomic control, the brainstem is also involved in arousal and consciousness. So structures within the brainstem help regulate the sleep-wake cycle and determines levels of alertness and responsiveness to the environment. So damage to the system can result in reduced consciousness, coma, or disorders of consciousness such as vegetative or minimally conscious state. So you've probably heard that when there are injuries, a lot of times it happens from sports. I have heard a lot of people who get this type of damage from skiing. You might, result in a coma or a vegetative state, or eventually, of course, death. So this is why damage to the brainstem is often life-threatening, because even the small lesions can disrupt these essential functions. So sometimes causes such as stroke, traumatic brain injury, tumors, or neurodegenerative disease can also have devastating effects when they involve this region. So also these causes, of course, can involve this region. So it doesn't just have to be trauma, it can also be a stroke or a tumor. And in neuropsychology and clinical neurology, brainstem integrity is therefore a very critical consideration, as impairment here can overshadow or preclude higher cognitive assessment altogether. So understanding the role of the brainstem reinforces the, I would say, hierarchy or the hierarchical organization of the nervous system, from survival to actual complex cognition. And talking about hemispheres, so although the two hemispheres of the brain work together as an, I would say, integrated system, certain cognitive functions tend to be lateralized, meaning that they're more strongly associated with one hemisphere than the other. So in most individuals, the left hemisphere plays a dominant role in language, analytical processing, and sequential reasoning, while the right hemisphere is more involved in visuospatial processing, emotional interpretation, and holistic perception. So this lateralization reflects functional specialization rather than obsolete separation, as both hemispheres contribute to nearly all complex behaviors. Importantly, hemispheric specialization is not uniform across all individuals. So factors such as handedness, whether you're right-handed or left-handed, development, and neural plasticity can influence how functions are distributed between the hemispheres. So for example, language is typically left lateralized. Some individuals can still show bilateral or even right hemisphere language representation. So this variability is especially relevant in clinical contexts, where assumptions about lateralization must be considered very carefully and supported by assessment data rather than taken for granted. Because as you can see, there are still differences between individuals. So what is typical and should be in most doesn't mean that it's in all. And neuropsychological assessment often relies on these hemispheric asymmetries to help localize brain dysfunction. So patterns such as verbal memory deficits alongside preserved visuospatial abilities may suggest left hemisphere involvement, whereas then those visuospatial impairments with relatively intact language may point towards right hemisphere dysfunction. So it can be like a starting point for neuropsychologists and clinicians to make informed inferences about the underlying neural systems and better understand the cognitive and behavioral consequences of brain injury or disease. And modern neuroscience increasingly emphasizes the idea that cognition and behavior arise from networks of interconnected brain regions rather than from isolated single function centers. So again, if you read medical news, this is what you will often see, the new discoveries, and now we're looking at it as an interconnected regions rather than isolated centers. Early models, however, of the brain function focused on localization. So they tried assigning specific abilities to discrete areas. But now we understand that most cognitive processes actually depend on coordinated activity across multiple regions working together. And this is why I keep emphasizing the brain is a very complex structure. So functions such as attention, as you're now paying attention in my class, memory, so for example, what you'll remember from my class, language, how we communicate in this class, and executive control all emerge from dynamic interactions within and between neural networks. So because of this network-based organization, cognitive deficits often arise not from complete damage to a single brain area, but from disruptions in connectivity between regions. So injury, disease, or degeneration can interfere with communication pathways, leading to inefficient or uncoordinated processing, even when individual brain structures remain relatively intact. So this concept actually helps explain why some individuals show widespread cognitive difficulties following diffuse brain injury, such as traumatic brain injury, despite the absence of a clearly localized lesion. And neurotransmitters. This is an important part to bring up in this class. So you might have heard of this term. And neurotransmitters are the chemical messengers that allow neurons to communicate with one another. So when a neuron is activated, it releases neurotransmitters into the synapse, where they bind to receptors on a neighboring neuron and influence whether that neuron will fire. And this chemical signaling underlies every aspect of brain function, from basic sensory processing to complex cognition, emotion, and behavior. So without neurotransmitters, coordinated neural activity, and of course also thought and behavior would not be possible. So different neurotransmitter systems have distinct roles in the brain, influencing how neural networks function and adapt. So for example, some neurotransmitters increase neural excitation, others inhibit activity, and many modulate how signals are processed over time. So balanced neurotransmitter activity is essential for normal brain function, while imbalances can disrupt communication within and between neural networks. So these disruptions can manifest as cognitive impairment, mood changes, movement disorders, or altered perception. So you might have heard that many neurological and psychiatric treatments work by altering neurotransmitter systems in order to restore more typical patterns of neural communication. So medications for conditions such as depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, and Parkinson's disease often target specific neurotransmitters to increase or decrease their availability or receptor activity. So understanding neurotransmitters is therefore actually provides a crucial link between the brain biology and clinical intervention, helping, of course, neuropsychologists interpret treatment effects and understand how chemical changes can influence cognition and behavior. And each neurotransmitter system in the brain has obviously distinct and maybe, of course, also overlapping functions that contribute to cognition, emotion, and behavior. So rather than acting in isolation, neurotransmitters modulate how neural networks operate and therefore influence the efficiency, flexibility, and stability of communication between neurons. So for example, dopamine is central to movement, motivation, and reward processing. So it plays a key role in the basal ganglia circuits that regulate motor control, which is why this dopamine depletion leads to motor symptoms that we would see in Parkinson's disease. So dopamine is also involved in reinforcement learning and motivation, influencing how we pursue our goals and respond to certain rewards. So dysregulation of dopamine systems is implicated not only in movement disorders, but also in conditions such as schizophrenia, addiction, and mood disorders. There's also acetylcholine, which in contrast is especially critical for memory and attention. So it supports learning, sustained focus, and the encoding of new information. So actually everything that you need today and in my classes, particularly in cortical and hippocampal networks. So degeneration of cholinergic systems is actually a hallmark of Alzheimer's disease and contributes to memory impairment and attention difficulties. There are, of course, other neurotransmitters such as serotonin, glutamate, and GABA, which also play essential roles in mood regulation, excitation, and inhibition. So together, these chemical systems shape how the brain processes information and adapts to both internal and external demands. So brain structure does not rigidly determine behavior, but it does set important constraints and possibilities for how cognition, emotion, and action can unfold. So, in other words, the brain provides the biological framework within which behavior occurs, but it does not function as a simple one-to-one blueprint. So individuals with similar brain injuries or neurological conditions can actually show very different cognitive and behavioral outcomes, shaped by factors such as development, experience, environment, and also neuroplasticity. So if you see two patients with Parkinson's disease at the same stage, they will not present the same way. So they will have very different symptoms and very different outcomes. Neuropsychology is particularly interested also in how these biological constraints interact with individual differences. So rather than assuming that a given lesion or diagnosis produces a fixed outcome, neuropsychologists actually examine how specific brain changes manifest in a particular person's daily functioning. So this is what we spoke about in the first class as well. So neuropsychology deals with a very particular individual's function. And this approach recognizes that the same structural abnormality can affect one individual's memory, but maybe another individual's attention, and even another individual's emotional regulation, depending on their unique neural organization and actually their life history. So, by focusing on these individual level relationships, neuropsychology bridges neuroscience and real world behavior. And of course, why are we talking about all of this? So, clinical relevance. So, clinicians use knowledge of brain structure to make sense of neuropsychological assessment results in a meaningful way. So, test scores on their own provide very limited information, as you know. So, it is the interpretation of patterns across multiple domains that allows clinicians to infer which brain systems may be functioning atypically. So, by understanding how specific brain regions and networks support cognition and behavior, clinicians can move beyond surface level performance and link assessment findings to underlying neural mechanisms. And the key takeaways from today's class, which is over actually quite quickly. So, understanding normal brain organization is essential before we can meaningfully understand pathology. So, in neuropsychology, deficits and disorders are always interpreted in relation to typical structure and function. So, without a clear sense of how the brain operates under normal conditions, it becomes difficult to recognize what has changed, what is impaired, and what remains intact. So, this is why a solid foundation in brain anatomy and function is a prerequisite for studying neurological and psychiatric conditions. And with that, I want to say thank you for joining my class today. And yeah, I look forward to seeing you in my future classes. And if there are any questions, we have a few minutes. You can ask me those questions. If not, you can also email me after class.
Thank you very much, Dr. Paula Abola. That was thoroughly amazing. Ladies and gentlemen, what we just got is not an ordinary university lecture. It was a very comprehensive and adequate picture of how multiple functions of the brain interact, communicate with each other to trigger behaviors. That's the best way to understand those behaviors, regardless of the settings where you are. A wonderful job for which Dr. Abola, the entire family of Atlantic International University is very, very grateful to you.
Thank you.
Not too much time for comments, so let's dive real quick into the questions, beginning with Francis Malcolm. Francis, go ahead.
Good morning,
Hi.
Dr. Abola and Dr. Valsin and to the whole class. Have a wonderful day. I'm looking at the real clinical psychology of the human attitude because of his brain function towards things learned from things that were wrongly understood in the past that has allowed their brain to become now dysfunctional to change, dysfunctional to society, dysfunctional to development of what is really an intense regulation for the same human brain, for the same thing that they are, temporarily involved in. Temporarily involved in, example, religion, example, revelations, etc.
What is your specific question, please, Francis?
A question would go towards how do you see it as a brain specialist in that organized functionally dysfunctionality?
All right. You get the point, Dr. Abola?
Not fully. So, I mean, we talk about the brain dysfunction, right? So, as I said, throughout my class and also last time, so we can just start with a certain dysfunction, with a certain symptom to trace back to a specific brain region, but we cannot make the assumption that it's actually coming from there. So that requires a lot of different assessments. So I'm not sure I understood your question completely fully, but I mean, you're asking about how the dysfunction is organized, or?
Can you be more specific, Francis?
Yes. Based on the answer that he
Briefly,
has
make it
already
brief,
given,
please.
Dr. Valsin, it's a little bit more clearer
Okay.
to what
Okay.
she's saying. However,
All right.
because she didn't get the direct hit on the things that are affecting people generally, I'm going to give her one little hint. Example, in our world, our religion has been affected by things that were wrongfully taught in early days. So because revelation is so adept now for change, these persons who had believed in the wrongly taught and understood things are not functionally in their brain to adapt to that change, even though even a part of the scripture say that this change will be evident when buildings are reaching up into the heavens.
All right.
Okay.
Anything you want to add, Dr. Abola?
I think that we're already shifting away just from the science, but I like the thinking, yeah. But
All right.
we're short on the time today.
That's true. That's true.
Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're gonna have, I'm so sorry, we're gonna manage to take one more question, or maybe two, Dr. Abola, but no more than two questions. What is yours, Donna, Jonas?
Yes, thank you very much,
Very
Doctor.
quick, please.
Yes, just to what are the language between the brain and different type of intelligence?
Thank you.
Because actually they talk about emotional intelligence, and I want to know what are the language between brain and brain structure and intelligence. Last question is about environmental factors who can influence our brain structure. You don't talk about it.
Thank you.
Okay.
Dr. Abola.
Yeah, that's a good question, but I would say it's complicated to answer just in one. So I think that we will talk about this in a future class. But overall, different types of intelligence are linked to different brain systems and structures. So the cognitive and intellectual intelligence, which we actually know as brain intelligence, it's the key region is the prefrontal cortex and also the parietal lobe, also the hippocampus, and it's to do with executive functioning, also our processing speed, working memory, of course, and attention regulation, right? So the damage to these areas would reduce our IQ type of functioning, so to say. And then we have, as you mentioned, emotional intelligence. So that would be recognizing emotions in yourself and others, emotional regulation, how you feel empathy. And here we have different key regions. So we have the amygdala, we have the insula, and also the ACC. So it would be social cognition, emotion regulation, as I said, empathy, moral reasoning. And damage here would produce poor emotional judgment, impulsivity from many people, also reduced empathy, and socially inappropriate behavior. So I think those are the key differences. So they obviously are related to different brain structures. But as I said, as we go through this course, we still have 8 more classes, then we will touch on this in more detail.
Very, very clear. As I said, ladies and gentlemen, we're running out of time. We're going to take no more than 1 more questions. Let's try Lucy Chikoto. Are you ready, Lucy? Lucy Chikoto?
Yes. Yes. Mine is not a very complicated question. Thank you. I just wanted to know how you would explain cataracts.
Cataracts.
Yeah, in the eyes, yeah.
Okay, so this doesn't really have to do with the brain, but well, in simple terms, cataracts is obviously so you get the part in the eye that is, so it would be foggy, right? So normally people would need surgery to remove that. What is bad with cataracts is if you do not, remove it and don't do the surgery on time, it can go into glaucoma, which means you can lose your vision permanently. So this is actually why it's important to diagnose it early and do the surgery, because it's not as complicated as people think, and it's not even as scary, but it should be done earlier rather than later. So sometimes I think cataract is also referred to as the foggy window, because you just see through the eye as just fog. Yeah.
All right. Thank you once again very, very much, Dr. Abula. Ladies and gentlemen, remember that is just the second of a long, huge series of classes by Dr. Abula. Not only are you able to request a copy of the entire PDF documents from your tutors, but also you're going to be in touch with our SME, Dr. Abula, throughout the implementation of these courses. So you're going to have plenty of time to ask questions and interact again with that phenomenal presenter, Dr. Paula Abula. What is your conclusion, please, Doctor?
Yes, so thank you everybody, of course, for joining my class again, and I look forward to working with all of you still in the next 8 classes. I think that most of you do have also my email address. I cannot type in the chat because it's disabled for the reason. I would give my email address again if I could. But if anything, you can reach out to me, and we will see each other soon in the future class again.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Ladies and gentlemen, once again, thank you for your attendance. And I'm convinced you have a word, the last word, to Dr. Paula Abula. What is that word, please, at this time?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Paula. Thank you very much.
Very much. Very pleased to be with you this Monday. Be blessed. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.